A compressor, like we've said already, is a device that compresses or squashes your signal if it gets above a certain threshold. Any signal above that threshold is reduced by a ratio. Let's say a 2-to-1 ratio would halve anything above that threshold, and say a 4-to-1 would reduce that down to basically a quarter of what it would normally be above that threshold. Now, a limiter is basically a compressor with a very high ratio. A compressor just places basically a hard ceiling on the signal, and it really doesn't let almost anything get above that. There's no real set definition of when a compressor becomes a limiter, but a lot of people tend to think anything above a 10-to-1 ratio is kind of approaching a compressor being a limiter. Now, the third type, a gate, is an interesting thing, is that it's almost like a compressor in reverse. Anything below that threshold is reduced by a ratio. In a strict noise gate, you could have a signal like say, a noisy guitar amp and set the threshold so that only the signal above it gets through and that lower signal gets cut right out. Let's actually hear an example of this. Do you hear all that noise in between the strumming of the guitar? Now let's hear that with a noise gate. Now it's important to know that the noise is actually present in the second, look on the right hand side of the slide, it's present within those guitar chords. But because the guitar chords are so loud, it masks that noise. It's only really when the guitar stops playing in between those chords that the noise becomes present. So with a noise gate, a properly set noise gate, is you can really chop that out when the instrument isn't playing, and that will drastically reduce the noise in your recordings. So these are the three different dynamic processes that we'll look at. And in the kind of the broadest description, they are compressors, let's squash that signal down. Limiters, let's squash it so hard so the signal will never get above that threshold. And then the third one are gates. Let's cut out all the low-level stuff down below the threshold. They are kind of in broad strokes what we're going to learn about in this course. We'll learn what every type of dynamic processor does, what every control does, how to route them in your signal chain, and most importantly, you'll get to see, how I use them in action. You'll literally look over my shoulder as we use these effects, these dynamic effects, in a mix, in a bunch of different applications. So let's begin with compressors.